Hello, everyone. I'll stop the music. This is Professor Hamamoto. You have the right channel, don't worry. It's October 27th, year 2022. It's now 3:02 p.m. because I did a cold start here. And before I forget, today at 5 o'clock Pacific Daylight Time, and that would be 8 o'clock, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I have a show. It's the last Thursday of every month. I have a show with the great John O'Loughlin. It's a 60-minute show, but it has to be Macduff Lives 2. Macduff Lives 2. You have to have the Arabic number 2 there because there's 2 or 3 channels there because of problems with TubeView. So I hope to see you there. We'll be ranging on through a number of topics, perhaps even related to this, because as unlikely as it may seem, the tortured life, and he died at age 40 by his own hand. And I do think it was a suicide. Despite the seeming distance from the everyday life of most people around the world, unless you're one of the Illuminists, there's some close contact, civilizational contact, power contact, New World Order contact between the life, the lineage of one Alexander McQueen and you and me, no matter where we live around the world, because he was of Scottish descent. There was something called the Scottish Enlightenment, with all the great science and thought, social thought, and theological speculation came through. It was also an age of exploration. It really was starting north of England. It really started to get underway in Scotland, circling the world, including where my people come from in East Asia, right? The British East Asia Company, for example, the shipping from that part of the world. So when I say we're talking about New World Order, Alexander McQueen, I came to realize, and I've been studying him for about 7 years now, looking at my old notes and manuscripts and whatnot, at least 7 years, probably longer than that, because I knew he was an important figure. And I didn't know that years later I'd be given a talk on TubeView here. I thought I would be presenting this in a book or some sort of academic conference. But YouTube's an effective medium. I'm finally beginning to realize that YouTube or TubeView could be my destiny. And I shouldn't feel bad about it or guilty. I don't really, but I'm mocking it at the same time, because the guy that created Wonder Woman was a PhD from Harvard, who was an academic. He also had a lot of crazy sex kinks, including bondage, what's called today BDSMD, which is very much central to the aesthetic of Alexander McQueen. Now, this guy was writing Wonder Woman back in the 1940s. And he didn't write under his own name. He used a pseudonym because he thought, well, I'm writing comics and this is going to ruin my. But the deal is his impact writing comic books, Wonder Woman, far outstripped what most people accomplished in the academic world. So I thought about that. I said, yeah, YouTube, I'm going to embrace it. I'm proud. Say it loud. I'm YouTube. Okay, so today's title is kind of a little bit pedantic, wouldn't you think? Alexander McQueen and the Epigenetics of Cruelty and Dark Deeds. That's where the poetry comes in. Cruelty and dark deeds. Sounds kind of late Victorian or Edwardian, don't you think? That's what I was going for. But epigenetics, very briefly, and this is not a technical definition, that is the notion that parts of our lives, either behaviorally, the psychology, spiritually, cross generations, independent of genes, the genetic endowment. Now, the powers that be, the biogeneticists, the one who've been hired to re-engineer humanity at the genetic level, they've made some huge strides in the area of genetics. Epigenetics, that's something that they're really trying to tackle now. And that's why they're studying the Hopi, the Zuni, all the indigenous people, and studying us very carefully. We everyday people, they haven't got us yet on the genetic level. On the genetic level, I think they've made a lot of progress just by looking around on the street, the supermarket. You see people that definitely have physical traits that I don't remember um, growing up, even as a young adult. It's the human species seems to be evolving or devolving to something unrecognizable. But that's for another talk. So I'm going to skip the sensationalism. I'm telling all the looky-loos up front that I'm not going to repeat a lot of the stuff that you want to hear, right? And I finally realized that a lot of people watch these shows not because they want to learn something or they want to be challenged in any sort of way. They want nice. They want Dr. Todd Grant. They want to be exposed to what they already know, right? I don't know what the psychology behind that is. Maybe they feel smarter or they feel part of the group. They're accepted because they know all about the Illuminati and Tavistock and all the other and the sexy Nazis, of course. All right. So I'm not going to belabor that point. I'm just telling you that if that's what you want, you'll have to tune into Dr. Todd Grandy. That's not to say that there isn't sensational content here, if you want to call it that. That's inherent to what I'm putting it. If you're away from the screen, I'm putting it in air quotation marks, right? Alexander McQueen, right? That wasn't his real name either, right? Just like, Cade Spade, that was her brand more than her real self. By the way, I found out because that was kind of, I showed that little clip from last Tuesday on Kate Spade, and she introduced, hi, I'm Kate Valentine Spade. And I could have sworn, I said, I thought her middle name was Noel, Kate Noel Spade. And I remembered her middle name because she was a Christmas baby or Christmas Eve, maybe more properly. Some people celebrate Christmas on the eve. You open your presents, and that's, some people have to wait till the 25th. But so it's in that window. But she was a Christmas baby. And the reason why she changed her name, I think, is and the reason why she might have been killed is because she changed her name since Kate Spade was sold, right? Her soul was sold and her brand, and she was going to, even before she died at age 55, she was ready to make a comeback. And that is pertinent to today's talk as well, because I didn't reckon all the numbers. I didn't add them all together, but Alexander McQueen died a very, very wealthy man, both in real estate, bank accounts. Who knows what offshore accounts he had or had it stashed here and there. But I mean, he was so wealthy that he even bequeathed some of his, which endears me to him. He bequeathed some of his longtime servants and assistants and helpers and staff people pretty tidy sum of money before, and he wrote them in his will before he killed himself. And that includes one, I think his name was Cesar Garcia. He and his wife, I think they were Colombian immigrants to the UK. They were his assistants for helpers or staff people for 10 years. And they each got £50,000 from the will of Alexander McQueen. That's one of the reasons why I don't think he meant foul play. I'm sure there are a lot of people who were, just kind of waiting for him to do himself in, like his lawyers and all the people that ran the charities are going to start picking his bones. But I think it was an act of deliberate self-sacrifice or suicide, if you will. The reasons we can only speculate about, right? And people do that on the channels here and watch. I'm sure Dr. Todd Grandy has a piece on Alexander McQueen, or someone brought him a script in order to do something on that because it's guaranteed clickbait, right? But my argument here is a much I would say, much more substantive and significant and serious. And it's a theme that recurs in my talks going back almost 2 years now. And that's one of incest. That's one of intergenerational, transgenerational sexual abuse, sexual trauma, if you will. And even before I knew anything about Alexander, by the way, his full name is Lee Alexander McQueen. He took the name Alexander McQueen professionally. His friends, definitely his family knew him as Lee. That I didn't finish my thought about Kate Spade and Kate Alexander Spade and Kate Noel Spade. So he's a synthetic creation himself, and he would be the first to admit it, of course. But the point I wanted to make about, before you tune out, I'm going to give you the argument right at the top of the show. The point I'm making here is that what Alexander McQueen represents to me is the public ritual enactment of sex trauma, sex abuse, transgenerational sex abuse, which is the very glue, the tie that binds. Sorry for the bad pun, because Cesar Garcia, his 10-year running servant, his helper, found him, Alexander McQueen, hanging from a ligature in his wardrobe. Now, here's the man that created wardrobes for the Illuminati bloodlines, and he decided to kill himself in his own wardrobe. He first tried the bathroom, but I think the shower head didn't hold, if you want to know. I mean, you could read about the gruesome details in all the different newspapers. But getting back to the point here, Alexander McQueen, and I think he knew this. He might have not known this on an intellectual level. He's not. It said in his biographies, he wasn't an intellectual by any chance. A lot of the themes, like the one I just showed you, that was called Atlantis Recovered, or something. It was about Plato's Atlantis. I doubt if he ever read Plato. He might have read about Atlantis has been fun since Victorian times or before in England and America. It's all kinds of literature. It's fascinating, right? But this one was called Plato's Atlantis because apparently, and I can't remember reading this in Plato, apparently Plato mentioned Atlantis in one of his long discourses. So, and I think, to finish my thought, I think since he didn't have the wherewithal, he left school at 16. I'm not putting him down, but he just didn't have any book knowledge. Design knowledge, yes, and practical tailoring and pattern cutting and design work, yeah, genius, which I'll get to in a moment. But I think the thematics and a lot of the scenarios that were enacted on stage, and they were becoming like theatrical pieces unto them. So no longer just the old-fashioned runways, but this is performance art meeting haute couture, right, or high fashion. And by the way, Esprit and Forever 21 and even Victoria's Secret, that's not what I'm talking about. That's mass market stuff. I'm talking about haute couture. That services the bloodlines, okay? So when you say, yeah, I know all about fashion. I used to work at Esprit or one of those mall stores, right? I'm not putting them down, but I'm saying that you don't know what I'm talking about. You weren't in the fashion industry. You were in the mass market industry. I'm talking about the people that Condé Nast Publications, with the head witch, Anna Wintour, right, the British agent. Or Tina Brown, her fake opposition, right, also in America, running fashion magazines from the city of London. That's the group I'm talking about here. So we're talking about New World Order. Some people call it whatever you want to call it. This is what I'm dealing with, not the mass market stuff. That's not the shopping mall stuff, which we'll get to. I'm going to talk about the king of shopping malls in a future talk. I'm reading up on him. He's fascinating. He's a brilliant guy. His name's Alfred Taubman. He's the guy that's usually credited or blamed for the mallization or the mauling of America. But uh, yeah, he did help reshape the suburban landscape of America. I'm going to be talking about him because he's very much involved in this reengineering of American life. And of course, that's where Forever 21 and Victoria's Secret, they all grew hand in hand. All right. So, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So, uh, again, this is so important. I have to restart this. This is what I refer to as the intergenerational glue that ties the bind, that holds together the power of these groups that oppress us to this very day. The bioassassins that attacked us recently. I don't know what they have in store for us in the future, but the better in tune we are to their dark history, right? Their whole record of cruelty and dark deeds, going back to the days of the ancestors of one Alexander McQueen. He wasn't the first Alexander McQueen in his bloodline, by the way. He is from a succession, a generational legacy of men on the paternal line. And I said paternal because that's the line of descent here. And we know that in the 19th century in particular, there was an attempt to subvert the patriarchal line, right, in Anglo-American society amongst the Illuminists, including the Theosophists. And I was reading this book in conjunction. I'll have to treat it separately. It's a substantial book in itself. You can't read it, but the title is Satanic Feminism. Right. So this does not begin with Alexander McQueen. He is, I think, the last gasp, the last manifestation of these bloodlines that are just desperately trying to hold on to the occult power that kept them intact for generations. They know they can feel it slipping away, and they're desperate. And of course, desperate times call for desperate measures. And they are throwing everything they have at us right now. But because of the mass awakening at all sectors of society, including working class to intelligentsia, right? Medical doctors, architects and engineers, attorneys, professors, not so much. I'm the only one out there, right? Even though people like to claim that the Canadian Jordan Peters, sorry, Sarita, I had to name check him because he's so big. And he's a bête noire with me. That's one Jordan. He was a synthetic person created to negate me. That's my claim. And if he wants to debate the point with me on my show, he's welcome to do so. But the point is that there's a mass awakening amongst the professional classes who are in a position to challenge this architectonics of and history of cruelty and dark deeds, right? We're not talking about just Roger Corman stuff. That's just sort of conditioning, right? I'm talking about the real horror, and it's not show, just horror, including Jack the Ripper. And I should mention that because it looms large in his career, we're talking about Alexander McQueen, that his family historically were from the East End, right? And Spitalfield in specific. I think he himself was born in the south of London, but his roots are in the East End for a few generations. Poverty, squalor, right? By the way, all the books on McQueen and talk about his rough life, his family life in the East End don't mention Chinese, right? Even though, as I've mentioned time and time again, it's the Asian world where Europe tried to create its first empires and started extracting the wealth of the world to create the foundation, the infrastructure for what we now know as the New World Order. But these books never mention the Chinese of the East End. Again, you have to go to the popular culture to find out what's really going on. You know who Fu Manchu is, don't you? Created by Sax Rohmer, the British author. He was fictionalizing for popular consumption the anxieties that people of that era were feeling about the mass infestation of the Chinamen to the East End with their opium dens and their criminality. Sound familiar? It sounds like Harry the Greek with his whole fixation, his whole boner about the Chacoms or the Mexicans, whoever else it is. I'm not saying we don't have problems in this area. Believe me, I'm grounded in reality, but I'm seeing the similarities in the hysteria and the panic that's created here. But anyway, those are his roots, multi-generationally. Alexander McQueen. Now, how does people get so poor? That's how we say poor up in the Appalachians here in America. Po, po. You're so poor you can't even come up with the last two consonants. Po, poor. Well, his family were Scottish, very proud of it. In fact, the kilt, he put that in as part of his trademark. He even, let's see, I think I have a pic of that. Here we go. He's with that great American witch, Sarah Jessica Parker. Look at, they're both rocking the Alexander McQueen kilt. There she is. This is probably around, I guess, Sex in the City time. You remember that, the Sex in the City scare? When all the girls wanted to leave Kansas City, Missouri, and go to New York and live the glamorous lifestyle, just like Holy Golightly 2 generations before, Breakfast and Tiffany's, Audrey Hepburn, another mind-controlled, groomed monarch character. Remember that? Sex in the City? Yeah, I remember Manolo Blahnik. She made him famous. By the way, it's a really good documentary on Manolo Blahnik. And by the way, I'm not against haute couture. I find it fascinating. I find it interesting. And I find that it attracts some of the most creative people in the face of the earth, the real good ones. I mean, this is like a real competitive field. It is really, really, really super competitive. I mean, it should come as no surprise where a lot of people buckle under the pressure, like Alexander McQueen. I think he also had this is speculation on my part. I think he also had a serious crisis of conscience. He killed himself the day before his mother's funeral, right? So the timing has to be taken. She was the love of his life, his mother, who to me, and I've only read a couple biographies, right? I'll show, let me see if I have the cover art for it. Well, I'll show it to you anyway. But from what I read, she's a wonderful woman. Herself grew up under harsh conditions in the East End. Father abusive, mother alcoholic. It's really working class, hard, disciplined people, good, salty there, but just trouble because of the crushing poverty. And his sister as well, who was older by 15 years, who he thought was his mother, right? Again, we're talking about incest, and sometimes that used to happen even as recently as the 70s when he was born, but certainly in an earlier time. Let's say a teenager got knocked up. She would have been 15 when he was born, his older sister. They would say, well, they would say, send the girl off to their aunt's house out in the country or somewhere else where she'd give birth in secret. And then she'd come back and the child would be raised like that was his older sister. Then there was a 15-year age gap. And sound familiar? That was the case of John Winston Lennon. His mother got knocked up at a fairly young age by an American serviceman or Canadian. I can't remember. This is during the, I think it was during the war. He's a war baby. I'm talking about John Lennon, not McQueen. So anyway, I'm just mentioning this. There's so much material in here that reinforces what I've been talking about: issues of sex trauma, sex abuse, incest, illegitimacy, bastardy, if you will, right? Because the bastards, some of the most mean, desperate people out there who aren't even hit by Lucifer, man. You add Lucifer to the mix, and they're really a force to reckon with, are bastards who are trying to regain the throne. some sort of crown of legitimacy. I'm not talking about just nobility. I'm talking about people who, everyday people, who got screwed out of a legacy or never really were part of the family because they were rumored to be someone else's love child, right? So all these elements are there with Alexander McQueen, and these are all. I think that was easy to call, not just me. By his fashion, by his shows, by the sensation, by his degradation of women. Even though he was a mama's boy, he loved his mama. Right? He loved her so much he couldn't bear to go to her funeral. He killed himself. And he was tore up even before when she went, and she was not a young lady. She died at, she was given her biblical number of years to live and procreate and contribute. And she was an amateur historian, right? I won't even call her an amateur. She was a hardcore historian of her Scottish roots. That's where Alexander McQueen got it. So what does that teach you and me? We gotta stay in touch with it, right? I had a guest on a couple of weeks ago, Anton Chaikin. I said, you got to take me back 3 generations of the Chaikin family, paternal and maternal, because I want to understand where you're coming from and who, what you're about through these generations. Not only that, not only was his mother just, and some people would dismiss this, by the way, as just, oh, they're so poor and they were underclass and they just needed to have this sort of fantasy of a noble past. Yeah, maybe that's an element of it. But I think you're not, people who are trying to dismiss it don't really fully understand the power of epigenetics and cultural memory, historical memory, which is always is being blotted out methodically, right? There's a science right now about creating amnesia. I mean, the cognitive scientists are working on it as we speak right now. They want to be able to completely move this aside, and that's why I'm stressing the importance of this oral tradition. How do you think the Zunis and Hopis, the Pueblo people in general, how do you think any group just manages to survive through the generations, through millennia, but through these stories, these tales, these mythologies? They don't necessarily have to be heroic. They're full of blood, murder, mayhem, jealousy, rivalry, blood feuds. I mean, gosh, read the Bible. It's in there. Read the murder ballads of the Appalachian people. Listen to their folk. I mean, like, yeah, I killed him because I found him with my, on and on. It's universal. But the mother kept the maternal line. The father was a good guy, but he, in fact, in 69, I think McQueen was born. Around the same time that Alexander McQueen was, he was the youngest child, by the way. That's why he was the darling of the family, and they all showered attention on him. Especially his sister, his older sisters, right? He's just a cute little kid. But about around the same time that he was born, his father, Ron, was sent to an insane asylum. What was it called? Yeah. By the time he was committed, and he was there for 2 years, so he grew up for around 2. I'm talking about Alexander McQueen, about 2 years without knowing his dad is. So that kind of probably puts a question mark about, do I even have a father? Am I a bastard? Whatever. But anyway, there's all kinds of different themes that we can explore. But yeah, he was admitted, the father, Ron, who was a lorry driver, right? Early on, right? Even when lorries were pulled by horses, back then. This is right after the war; they were still using horses. And then I think eventually he became a black cab driver, which required a lot of study. But he was a motor man, right? But before they hit him, he came back he had a nervous breakdown and was at Cane Hill Hospital, which was built during the Victorian era. And I'm telling this because we're going to later on revisit Roger Corman and a film he produced called I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, starring Kathleen Quinlan and B.B. Anderson, by the way, the great Swedish actors who worked with Ingmar Bergman. I wondered how how Corman cast her in that film. But anyway, back then in the Victorian age, it was founded as the Third Surrey Country Pauper Lunatic Asylum. Okay, so um, McQueen's imaginary and his family is steeped in lunacy. It's also steeped in serial killing, right? East End Jack the Ripper. I didn't finish my thought. I'm sorry. This is 1888 when Jack the Ripper, everybody's heard of Jack the Ripper, right? And there's tons of books on it. I got to control myself and not digress there. It's very easy to start going off on Jack the Ripper. But that looms large in his own. It wasn't a story like for us. He lived in that area. He was steeped in it. It was not folklore for him. That was his life. It was such a part of his life. In addition to the commitment of his father to an insane asylum, right? The madness. It was such a big part of his life, Jack the Ripper, that that was his master's thesis at the school he was admitted to, which was called Central St. Martin's in London. I forgot the exact name of his master's thesis show. The reason why he was in a master's program, right? He skipped the bachelor's level because he had training. He apprenticed as a tailor on Savile Road, not Jimmy Savile, but Savile Road, where all the haberdashers, right, serve up, nobility. Prince Charles, right, now King Charles had his bespoke jackets, and this is not bespoke, so I don't know why I'm touching this. um, you get the picture. They had all their clothes made and shoes made there, and in fact, Prince Charles, it was folklore. Later, it was disconfirmed, but I'd like to think it was true that when he was apprenticing at one of these high-end haberdashers or clothiers, there was a jacket that was commissioned by Prince Charles and Alexander McQueen in the face, because he knew facing. He knew every aspect, unlike Kate Spade. That's why I think, I'm pretty sure that she's a synthetic creation, right? She was brought forward. She was just a girl from the Midwest who was artsy. Right. By the way, I learned more recently that Kansas City, Missouri is full of an occult tradition. It's a riverine civilization, riverine city. It's along the mighty Mississippi River, right? And those places, East St. Louis, Chicago, Memphis, the real Memphis, right? Not just Memphis, Tennessee, the one in Egypt. These and the Thames, of course, the Yalu River. These riverine societies usually have these civilizations that grow up in it that develop very sophisticated occultic systems. And I think St. Louis, Missouri was one of them. That's for a future investigation. So I don't think she comes from an innocent Midwestern background as I had assumed in my earlier talk on Tuesday. So I'm correcting myself right now. More investigations needed. But the point is that he was steeped in all that lore, including that of his Scottish ancestors. So yeah, he showed up at Central St. Martin's School, applying for a job as he was only 21 years old. He was applying for a job as a tutor for pattern making because he had experience of 6-7 years already working in Savile Row as a pattern cutter and as a I forgot to finish the story about Prince Charles. Yeah, he was doing the facing for one of his jackets and he drew a willy in it, a hairy ding dong, and he sewed it back up. And Prince Charles walking around with a willy, free willy, in his lapel. Later, that supposedly was disassembled, and they found out it was just one of those McQueen stories, right? But it bears repeating. And nonetheless, I like to think it was true. He had a perverse sense of humor. He did. Highly intelligent. But he went there to apply for a job as a tutor and said, "Oh, you're 21 years old. That's you're not much older than the students here. They're not going to listen to you in the classroom. So they enrolled him as a student because he showed them their drawings, and they were so impressed by this guy. And they were just says, "Wow, you've done it on Savile Road, and you know all these skills." And by the way, that's I'm saying this because that's another reason why he's one of those real haute couture designers. He paid his dues. He had the training, right? Eventually, Anna Wintour said, "Well, why do we need to pick him? Why do we need to groom Alexander, McQueen or John Galliano, whoever else that Anna Wintour and Tina Brown decide, or before her, Grace Mirabella, or these other arbiters of fashion on the global scale. We'll just make someone up. We'll just create it. We'll just pick someone from Mademoiselle, a staff person. Her name happens to be Kate Brosnahan or Kate Spade, right? So that's how that works. I'm not going to belabor, because I'm running out of time. I'm not going to belabor his time at school, but that was a formative period for him where he got the master's degree. And to finish the story about Jack the Ripper, that was the title, that was the theme of his master's show, right? It's his recital, if you will. And he was seen as a up and coming guy, right? All the talent spotters were there, including a woman. I don't know if she was at the show, but she latched on very quickly. Her name was it Blow? Yeah, this is, if Charles Dickens would have a field day if he was alive today. Her name was Isabella. Yeah, her name was Isabella Blow. That was her name. And I don't think I'm going to have time, but I had a picture of her with her funky hats. And she bought that whole collection, I think, from his master's thesis show, and gave him and also entree into the upper crust of British society, and later he became, of course, an international power player. Okay, let me continue with the importance of, and I don't have the book here. I have to give full credit to the author that I drew this, and I consult about 3 or 4 books in preparation for this talk. But this is a really good one. I recommend it. It's called Alexander McQueen, The Blood of, I can't remember, I didn't write the subtitle because I was going to show you the artwork. Published in 2016, Andrew Williams. It's brilliant. I'm a fan of writers already. Biographies, yeah, this guy is one of the best. And because I read it a few years ago and I just returned to it and bowled over by his perceptiveness and the work that Williams, the author of this biography, put into compiling this book. He interviewed dozens, maybe scores of people, including the McQueen family, the inner circle of the McQueen family, and was able to really synthesize the cultural history. He's far better than me. If you want to talk about cultural forensics, he's really good. And he puts it all in this book here. As an example, the book opens with a discussion of his mother's and his sister's obsession with Scottish history. Whether romanticized or real, that doesn't really matter. It's real to them, right? So let me quote from page 19. I'm not going to bore you with a long excursion here. When Lee was a boy, he would watch and wonder as his mother unrolled an 8-foot-long scroll decorated with an elaborate coat of arms. She would point out the names of long-dead ancestors on the family tree and talk about the past. Joyce was passionate about genealogy. That's his mother's name. And she taught the subject at the local adult education center. I guess this is in the East End. There were a lot of these working men, today working class, and they still have in Britain, schools for working people that wanted to improve their reading, their culture, advance themselves, certification. It's a part of the socialist working class tradition of self-organization amongst the British people, which remains very strong. And McQueen retained that working class ethic and mentality and resentment of the upper classes, even as he rose to the highest strata, hobnobbing with them. That's why I'm saying that his work was both a ritual reenactment of the brutality the bloodlust, the vampiric psychic energies that these people suck off of, the ones that were buying and supporting him. And he died a wealthy man, as I told you. He was servicing them, but at the same time, he was mocking them. And that comes from his epigenetic legacy of displacement, dispossession, genocide. Some of his relatives were exported to the Virginia colony. Some of them had to go to England and wound up in Liverpool. A lot of other, refugees from the empire, including, that's how the McCartneys wound up there. That's how the Lennons wound, the Harrisons, right? Those 3/4 of the Beatles right there. I'm just talking, that's the story of imperialism. That's the story of empire building. It's a dark one. It's a story of conquest. It's a story of the Southwest. The blood keeps seeping to the surface. That's epigenetics. And they're trying, them being the official historians, right? The fiction writers are trying to suppress it. Will not be suppressed. Alexander McQueen made sure of it with his fashions. Even, I'm sorry, this is a blasphemy but this is what he did. He did a portrait of the Madonna made out of maggots, right? And he just loved those bizarre dichotomies, right? A maggot, Madonna. My gosh. That's what was his self-described role in society, a disruptor, someone who'd like to create conflict and controversy. And that's a strategy that I can appreciate. I call that the Yojimbo strategy, where you have a hired hand, right? Yojimbo means a hired bodyguard. He was a hired hand, just like Kate Spade. But unlike Kate Spade, he went there to create discord and disharmony in society and hold a mirror of ugliness and deceit and genocide that comes from his own bloodlines against the people that were the descendants of those who dispossessed his family and consigned him and his family to a life of squalor in the East End. Do you understand? Am I being too disjointed here? Is this too Joycean? Is this too Ulysses? Joyce is another example of it. Irishmen, right? Dubliners, right? He had to leave his country just like D.H. Lawrence, right? So this is not something that's unique by any means. So his mother argued that the family, the McQueens, came from the McQueen side, came from northernmost part of Scotland. It's called the Isle of Skye. Stop right there. That's a beautiful, poetically named place. By the way, he was buried there after his suicide. His grave, Alexander McQueen's grave. He was cremated. The memorial is on the Isle of Skye, pronounced or spelled Skye. It might be an archaic spelling, but that's a beautiful place name. And okay, so according to the author Williams of the great biography, I tip my hat to this biographer. Lee had become increasingly fascinated with the island's Gothic history and his ancestors' place in it. Gosh, Edgar Allan Poe would appreciate that. Okay. So here's where the epigenetic suffering comes in. And this is where the irony plays out, in that him serving the ritualistic needs of this parasitic, vampiric, necrophilic, incestuous ruling class of Britain and America, the Anglo-American ruling class, which composed of bankers as well as your hereditary nobility. Right. So reading on here, it says, learning of his mother's tales of Scotland's brutal history and the suffering that his ancestors endured at the hands of the English landowners, he constructed an imaginative bloodline across the centuries. Lee's bond with Scotland grew increasingly strong over the years. It inspired collections such as Highland Rape, This was in 1995, very early on in his career, right? And Widows of Culloden, 2006. Now, I didn't know what the Battle of Culloden was, but that was the singular battle between what are now called the Jacobins, the people who believe, probably rightfully so, that the Scottish king's lineage bloodline are the rightful heirs to the British throne, not the Saxe-Coburg, the Hanoverians, later called the House of Windsor, who changed their lineage in around World War One time, World War, as they say, War One. I misspoke last Tuesday. I said World War Two, but it was World War One where they changed their identity. The House of Stuart is legitimate. By the way, Princess Diana was a Stuart, right? That's one of the reasons why they had to bring her in, as she described it, as a brood mare, so that lineage can be further legitimated. By the way, I forgot to mention this, but maybe I have. Meghan Markle, genealogist, this is not me saying this, is genealogists have sussed it out, and they find out that her and her hubby up in Santa Barbara, they're cousins. So when I say incest, I'm not just using this term figuratively. You dig? So the Willies, anyway, they lost the family, the clans. That particular clan lost the battle there, and then enough about British history to know that the Scots were dispossessed. A lot of them were thrown in prison. The rebels, right, are sent off to the colonies, Australia, Canada, America, and some of them went, further south into England and whatnot. Some of them were in prison, but some of them pledged loyalty to their new monarch, and pretend like their history was not, had been erased. So that's how the McQueen family were dispossessed. That's how they found their way into London. I think about 4 generations prior to Alexander McQueen. And there had been Alexander McQueens all the way down the line, and they all been patriots. They all been fighting men as well. And he was getting this tutorial from his mother's knee as a child, and his sister, who should also be credited for being the historian, not just of her family, but of the Scottish diaspora, if you will. And interesting, it plays out in the art that comes out of the fertile and creative minds of an Alexander McQueen. Also, and this is something that popped in my mind, I said, well, they're way up in Scotland. He's got to be part Norseman. And indeed, the book says, yeah, it's speculated he was a descendant of the Norsemen that invaded that part of the British Isle, what became the British Isles, and then on to Ireland and so on. They didn't call them. They would respond if you called them a Norseman, because that's the North, but they weren't. They didn't call themselves the Vikings. That's what the English people, because Viking means a raider, someone who's raiding. So that's the appellation that they were given. So Norseman is probably more popular, although I don't think any Swede or person who's descendant would be offended if you called them a Viking, right? Yeah, this is the Jacobite rebellion of the Battle of Culloden. This is back in 1746. This is not before the American War of Independence, the same time going on here. Okay. So here's where the epigenetic history of the McQueen family and the related clans that were vanquished at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Here's where epigenetically plays out in his perverted, denigrating, humiliating, anti-human fashion. Okay, I'll be the first to condemn his sexism, his misogyny. He's not homophobic. He himself was gay, but I think he had a lot of self-hate for being gay. And by the way, do I need to mention that he was sexually abused himself as a child around age 9 by his brother-in-law, who was the husband of the eldest sister, who he thought might have been his real mother? because she was 15 years older. Remember that? Her husband beat the hell out of her regularly to the point where she even lost two of her unborn children. This guy was such a mean bastard. And the author of this book, by the way, gives all three of his names: his Christian name, his middle name, and his family name, so that his name will live in infamy. Right? That's a form of justice that writers can take. Don't depend on the courts exclusively. Talks like this, I argue, books like this, I argue, are part of the restorative justice. And I'm saying that because we're all, oh yeah, let's pass a bill. Oh, let's hold a tribunal, right? Let's pass legislation. Let's take it to the Supreme. I'm going to sue you. Forget about it. There's other ways. Look at Alexander McQueen single-handedly. He had a great staff, by the way. And if they didn't work, he comes from solid working class stock. And his dad, Ron, said any of the kids started slacking off, man, they knew that he was not a happy person. So Alexander McQueen had that ethic. There was no hangers on, no party. Well, he did party outside of work. Too much, right? Drugs, all that you can imagine. But epigenetically, you saw how it was it manifested itself in his fashion, for better and for worse. Okay, I'm giving you the rationale behind it, because if you read something, this is on my Patreon site. I put a link to an article by a site that's been around forever. It's called The Vigilant Citizen. I think it used to be called The Vigilant Christian. I can't remember. Vigilant Citizen. It's a good site. And I'm not knocking it, but it has that sameness. Everything's satanic. Everything is Luciferian. Everything is Messiah. It's the same old drumbeat. It's that confirmation bias that people seem to need. And he or she have made a career on it. So I'm not knocking it. But I'm saying don't expect that from me. My take on he might have been influenced by satanic Luciferian elements. I don't know. I haven't read that yet, but it wouldn't surprise me. I think there's also a Freemasonic connection with Alexander McQueen, the one we're talking about, not his predecessors genealogically, because he also comes from a line of stonemasons for 3 or 4 generations. And you're not going to be a stonemason unless you're part of the guild. So his family might have been introduced to some of the rituals and the dark magic of the speculative end of Freeman. And you're talking about London too. That's where the Grand Lodge is. So that's research for the future. So don't just end with vigilant citizen. Oh yeah, he died by hanging. Kate Spade died by hanging. Mick Jagger's wife died by hanging. She was also designed. Like, okay, well, what's the point? You drew the connection there, but where's the lesson in that? All right, they die by hanging. Let's really find out what it's about. This is what it's about. And again, I'm reading from this great biography by Williams here. Joyce, that's his mother. Joyce never could quite work out the exact connection between the McQueens of Skye and her husband's forefathers, but she was certain that his ancestors would have suffered violence, poverty, and fragmentation, a triumvirate that continued to shape the family over the course of the next couple of centuries. That's the epigenetics. That's the theme of today's show. The author picked up on it, and Joyce McQueen, his beloved mum, understood this. And perhaps that's why she was able to sustain all the pain and the suffering of everyday life, and a husband who was sent to the lunatic asylum when her last son was born. That's the time when you want your husband around, I would think. And she didn't see him for 2 years. Right? And his older sister, who had suffered this incredible physical abuse by her family, and him, visited upon her younger brother, which she felt really, really guilty about. She trusted her husband. He was a brute, but she never thought he would be abusing her own brother. I mean, that's usually the way it works, right? It's not something that you can easily anticipate because it's so horrific, but that's what happened. So when Mom, Ron was, typical of most men, was a working man. They're not very effusive in their thoughts. They just work their asses off, right, and take care of business. But thanks to his mom, Joyce, she really understood what it was about, and that was, here's the takeaway. One of the takeaway points, that was a source of strength for the family. You understand? Survival. That's why the historical knowledge, historical consciousness is central to our survival as a species. And that is why it's methodically being erased by the usual suspects and also being rewritten in the academic world. You got it? I was a professor of Asian American history for 21 years. And when I started, it was not cool. Oh, how can Asian Americans have a history? And in every opportunity I get, I will promote that because it was Asia that created modern Europe. It was Asia that created modern capitalism, right? It wasn't Alexander Hamilton. It wasn't the founding fathers. They were the byproduct of this quest for empire, overseas empire. And that's how we understand world civilization. Okay, let me continue then. The more Joyce told Lee about his ancestors, the more he came to identify with them, viewing them as brave outsiders who fought against a system. Yes, they were brave hearts, all. His middle name, that reference is not in the book, by the way. It's just my cheesy reference. His middle name, Alexander, had been passed down through his immediate family since the beginning of the 19th century, when three brothers, Alexander, John, and William McQueen, all stonemasons, settled in London in the area of St. George in the East End, right? Oh, and to conclude, what would a talk be if I were not to include, if I did not include the Huguenot? Because I've been talking more and more and trying to put this into the historiography, the Huguenot or Huguenot, whichever you prefer, the Huguenot diaspora, right? There's a connection there. In 1806, Alexander, the eldest of the three brothers, married Sarah Vallas, a woman of Huguenot descent. Her heritage appealed to Lee, who was told by his mother that the, quote, Huguenots were French Protestants who flew from France after the Edict of Nantes. True. So she knew her history. She didn't go to college. I mean, she was self-taught, right? But she's a homegrown, organic intellectual, as Gramsci would describe. To escape persecution, you already know this from previous talks, right? The most popular place of settlement was Spitalfields, where they worked as silk weavers high in the garret rooms near a large window which lit their looms. They were craftspeople. See, I learned something there. I guess it stands to reason they would migrate to where all the newcomers were, like the Chinamen, right? The East End. All of the Chinese came later, but they were the fine craftsmen, right? The porcelain makers, the watchmakers, Swiss watch, Dutch, clockworks like Clockwork Orange. These are the people, and that was also part of his heritage, which maybe epigenetically, or hearing that story at least about his Huguenot ancestors who were well known for their lace work, handcraft and all that. Maybe that influenced him to go into couture, into clothing, apprenticing himself as I think he was something like 15, maybe as old as 16, but very, very young, because he left school and got himself jobs as an apprentice on Savile Row. That's the type of work he did. And his grandfather, by the way, made a living as a presser, right? Someone who would work because there was no manufactured clothing like, several generations ago. Everything, even for poor people, was handmade, usually by the women of the household could do that. That was part of their homemaking skills. But his grandfather had that training as well. So he has stonemasons, some people who were in the garment industry as well. So we heard these stories, and that's why stories that you're hearing today that I'm repeating and devising and contributing here on the Professor Hamamoto channel. And while it's on your mind, subscribe, because it's crucial to your survival and my survival and human survival that these stories, these presentations, these talks move into the future to inspire the healthy versions of the Alexander McQueens, the ones who understand their position objectively and can move past it, can learn from it, and can contribute something important to the larger society. And he created tons of jobs. He and a couple of other young designers around the same time that brought up created an estimated something like, in just London area, about something like 60,000 jobs related. Not just in his shop, but I mean related to the high fashion business. It's a very important from from an economic standpoint, not just politically. It's an important industry. That's why I don't want to trivialize or be dismissive of it. I want to encourage it. But without the pedophilia, without the royalty, without Elton John, or let me conclude with some of the clientele or clients here. We already saw her. You've got the great human rights lawyer. I'm being sarcastic. The great human rights lawyer Amal Clooney, and you got George Clooney on the right, another male monarch, closeted gay, synthetic creation. And then we even have former Attorney General William Barr, seen with Alexander McQueen on the right. No, that's not William Barr. I'm just kidding. That, as you know, is Sir Elton John, right? Another a big, McQueen fan right there. Listen, I've run out of time and I haven't even scratched the surface. There's so much material here. You got to read that book. It's incredible. All those little disclaimers that the newspapers and magazine articles have at the end of it says, yeah, be sure you see a mental health professional, call the hotline. They're exploiting the situation. They're selling copy. Everybody wants to read about the next celebrity suicide, right? The current one. But they put the little disclaimer, say, yeah, call, if you're it's because they make it into a mental health issue exclusively, right? I'm saying it's a political health issue. It's before you are reduced to having to call one of these hotlines. I have a better idea from you. Talk to your mother, your grandparents, everybody in your family. Compile your family history. Read the biographies, not just of your own ethnicity, of your own group, but everybody you can get a hold of. And by that historical knowledge and that wisdom and that strength that comes through there, that's how we will defeat the New World Order. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope, this is the last show of the Witching Month, which is celebrated by all the Satanists at the University of California, Davis, including the former dean who said she was a gay, a lesbian, a Luciferian. She was a Wiccan, proud of it in both cases. And Wicca as a religion is protected by our system of law here in our constitutional. So I'm not saying that we should ban it. I'm not even implying it. But that's where she was coming from. And that's my truth there. And all these Wiccans people here, all the satanic feminism that harkens back to the 19th century, you know what? It's only strengthened Orthodox Judaism. It's only strengthened Christianity. Whether you think contemporary Catholicism still qualifies as Christianity, I'll leave that for you to decide. But I have certain questions. But that's only made us stronger. And also it's made the world of Islam strong because they are fully aware that the modernity, thanks to colonization, imperialism, European imperialism, Japanese imperialism did not work. They realized that they tried it. They tried the European model. It didn't work for them. So they're trying a different approach, technology. The world of Islam also knows that Satan is real. And that's one of the reasons why they have declared war. At least certain sects within it have mobilized the examples, the living examples of evil that are out there. I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying that's a reason to declare war against the non-Islamic world. Hopefully, they'll watch this episode and understand that we're all being attacked by the same demonic force that was recognized by all the great thinkers, the believers or skeptics, or people who promulgated the thought, the wise men, the imams, the priests, the holy men, the desert fathers out of the Abrahamic tradition, the rabbis, of course, the reebs, the teachers, right? We're fighting the same force here, okay? So there's these divisions that have been artificially created to a certain extent or a large extent by British intelligence, right? T.E. Lawrence, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom. You never read the book, but you may have seen the movie, Lawrence of Arabia, right? Peter O'Toole, Omar Sharif, right? He was assassinated. I saw his motorcycle, what was left of it, or a replica at the Wool Museum in London. All right, because the divisions between, the so-called clash of civilizations, so favored by the Anglo-American intelligentsia and the military elite, are divisions that have been engineered to drive us into warfare, so that the people that Alexander McQueen catered to will have a world free of we useless eaters, including his own family. They considered his family useless eaters as well. They were Scots. So he's still getting his vengeance, his payback from beyond the grave. On October 27th, year 2022, we're still talking about the legacy of the full legacy of Alexander McQueen, not just the sensationalistic part of his career, which is abhorrent and should be condemned. The humiliating, anti-human aspect of his own self-hate that he externalized for reasons that I've discussed. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry for the conclusion upon a conclusion. We'll see you in the next month, and we'll start afresh. Thank you. Bye.